Before the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the decision had already been made quietly, silently, and far from the battlefield. These are the events no one talks about, the choices that altered the course of history before America even fired a shot. And once you hear them, you'll understand why the United States was destined to enter the greatest war humanity had ever seen. In the winter shadows of the early 1930s, while Europe trembled under the rise of dictators and Asia burned under imperial expansion, the United States stood behind an invisible wall, a wall built by memory, fear, and the belief that oceans could protect a nation from the world's storms. The scars of the First World War were still fresh, the graveyard still open, and the American public had made its position painfully clear. Never again, not our sons, not our soil, not our battles. But history is unforgiving to nations that try to hide from it, and beneath the calm surface of American neutrality, powerful forces were already shifting. This story begins not with explosions or battles, but with decisions, quiet decisions, made in boardrooms, offices, and private conversations. Decisions that almost no civilian ever heard about. Decisions that would steer an entire nation toward a fate it never thought it would face again. First cracks in neutrality appeared in the form of distant conflicts. Japanese forces marching into Manchuria, Italy seeking glory in Ethiopia, Germany shredding treaty after treaty as its armies grew bold under a single commanding voice. These events seemed far away, but behind closed doors, American leaders knew the storm clouds were drifting across the oceans with alarming speed. And then came the economic pressure. The United States, though publicly neutral, found itself at a crossroads. Its factories were humming, its ships crossing the Atlantic, its resources feeding the engines of nations already preparing for war. No declaration had been made, no alliances publicly forged. Yet the country's industrial heartbeat quietly began picking a side. These were not decisions forged in dramatic speeches, but in signatures, ink on paper, that would change the world. Still, neutrality held, at least on the surface. What truly began to pull the United States into the war were the less visible forces, forces shaped not by ideology, but by necessity. Trade routes collapsing under submarine attacks, allies begging for survival, and a global order tilting toward chaos. A domino effect was unfolding, and every fallen piece placed America in greater danger, whether it accepted it or not. By the late 1930s, the map of the world had changed beyond recognition. Democracies were shrinking. Empires of aggression were rising. The American government knew what the public refused to admit. A world dominated by expanding militaristic powers would not allow the United States to remain isolated forever. A decision had to be made not just about war, but about survival. Yet these decisions weren't shouted from podiums. They were buried in documents, disguised as aid programs, masked as financial relief. The neutrality laws that had once defined American policy were quietly bent, stretched, and eventually bypassed. By the time American destroyers and German U-boats exchanged fire in the cold Atlantic waters, the truth had become undeniable. The war had already reached America, even if America had not yet reached the war, and then came the one moment everyone remembers. The attack that finally forced the hand of the nation. But what history often forgets is this: Pearl Harbor was not the beginning. It was the confirmation of a path already forged. The United States had been edging closer to the conflict for years, step by step, decision by decision, until it stood at the point where turning back was no longer possible. Tonight, we are going to uncover that path. Not the famous battles, not the iconic speeches, not the moments written into every schoolbook. Instead, we will examine the choices made in silence, the political calculations, the diplomatic tensions, the strategic fears, and the economic realities that pushed a neutral nation into the deadliest war in human history. This is the story of how a country that wanted peace above all else found itself pulled slowly, reluctantly, and inevitably into global war. It's a story of hesitation, of responsibility, of unavoidable destiny, and it reveals a truth often hidden beneath the grand narratives of history. Nations are not thrust into war by a single moment, but by a chain of decisions stretching back years before the first shot is fired. As we explore these untold decisions, you will see how each one shaped the next, how uncertainty turned into strategy, and how strategy turned into action. You will witness the United States transform from an isolated observer into a global power, whose entry would alter the outcome of the war and the future of the modern world. By the end of this journey, you won't just understand why the United States entered World War II, you will understand why it had no choice. And more importantly, you will see how the fate of entire nations can hinge not on dramatic turning points, but on the quiet decisions made long before history recognizes their impact. In those early years before the world caught fire, a series of quiet moments began shaping a future no one could escape. They didn't look like history in the making. They looked like routine meetings, confidential memos, and late-night briefings in rooms where curtains stayed closed and voices stayed low. Yet in those rooms, the first steps toward a global conflict were already being taken, not by armies on the march, but by decisions whispered into the fabric of a nation trying desperately to remain untouched. It begins far from the battlefield, thousands of miles away from the crack of rifles or the echo of marching boots. In dimly lit offices, maps spread across polished tables, a handful of decision makers studied a world unraveling. Lines were being redrawn every month. Entire regions fell under new flags. Reports from diplomats spoke of leaders who cared nothing for treaties, promises, or human cost. And with each new update, the weight of neutrality became harder to justify. One document after another revealed a growing truth. The world was slipping toward chaos faster than anyone had predicted. War didn't erupt suddenly. It seeped across continents like a slow, dark tide. While the public was still debating whether overseas storms mattered, those behind the closed doors already sensed that the ocean was not wide enough to hold danger back. They watched factory production numbers rise, shipping lanes tighten, and foreign governments plead for help in tones colored by desperation. Every day, the choice to stay out grew thinner, but admitting this openly was impossible. The memory of the last war still stung. The people wanted peace, firm, unbreakable peace, so every decision had to be made carefully, quietly, and with the kind of subtlety that kept it hidden from the public eye. Supplies began shifting. Trade policies bent in new directions. Neutrality remained the official stance, yet the machinery of support was slowly turning toward nations fighting for survival. It was not a declaration, it was a quiet tilt, barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. There were voices warning that silence would only make the coming storm more violent. There were others who insisted that involvement, even indirectly, was a betrayal of the nation's promise. And caught between these opposing tempers, decisions slipped into motion that seemed harmless at first. A loan approved, a shipment authorized, a patrol route expanded. Each small choice felt manageable, reversible, safe, until they formed a chain that could no longer be broken. Night after night, reports arrived describing new conquests overseas, new threats, new dangers. The men who studied them felt a growing pressure, an understanding that waiting for the storm to reach the shore would be catastrophic. They weren't yet talking about war. They were talking about inevitability, and inevitability has a way of guiding hands even when the mind resists. So the United States moved, not with the roar of cannons, but with the soft scrape of pens signing decisions that would shape the nation's fate. No crowds watched these choices unfold. No headlines announced them. But in those quiet early steps, the path toward global war was already being drawn, one hidden decision at a time. Each new step created a tension that could no longer be ignored, a pressure that tightened with every shift in the world beyond America's shores. What had begun as quiet adjustments in policy soon collided with events too large, too violent, and too persistent to remain distant. The storm that once seemed far away was now pressing against every boundary, testing every line the nation had drawn to protect its neutrality. Across the oceans, the landscape changed with astonishing speed. Countries once thought secure collapsed under swift invasions. Governments fled in desperation. Armies that had stood proudly for generations were crushed in weeks. Every report that arrived carried the weight of urgency: cities burning, refugees flooding roads, alliances cracking under the sheer force of aggression. And with each dispatch, the illusion that America could remain untouched grew thinner. Within private meeting rooms, the atmosphere shifted. There was no longer the quiet confidence that oceans would shield the nation. Instead, there was a new awareness, an uneasy recognition that the crisis was spiraling far beyond the control of any single country. The question was no longer whether the world was changing. It was whether the United States could continue pretending it had no role in shaping what came next. Diplomats returned with grim faces and stories heavy with warning. Allies pleaded for help, not in the name of conquest, but in fear of extinction. Their voices carried a clarity that cut through every argument for isolation. If they fell, the world that America depended on, its trade, its security, its influence, would fall with them. And as these conversations echoed through the corridors of power, neutrality began to feel less like a shield and more like a fragile illusion. The breaking point did not arrive in a single dramatic moment. It emerged through a series of confrontations, each one pushing the boundaries of patience and restraint. Merchant ships were struck in waters once considered safe. Trade routes vital to global stability became battlegrounds patrolled by submarines hunting anything that dared to sail. The seas themselves had turned into an arena of silent warfare, and America's vessels were no longer distant witnesses. They were becoming targets. Publicly, calm statements declared that neutrality remained firm. Privately, maps on the walls were marked with new dangers: sunken ships, intercepted communications, expanding spheres of control. The pattern was impossible to dismiss. A nation that wished to avoid war was being pulled toward it by the simple fact that the world around it was collapsing. And then came the moral weight, an element far harder to measure, but impossible to ignore. News arrived of occupied territories, of civilians forced from their homes, of atrocities carried out with chilling efficiency. These stories traveled across the Atlantic like ghosts, haunting every discussion. They raised a question that struck deeper than policy or strategy. How long could a nation claim neutrality while the world was being reshaped by violence? Still, hesitation lingered. The memory of past sacrifices held tightly to the nation's conscience, but events pressed harder. Shipping losses mounted. Diplomatic negotiations faltered. The balance of power tilted so sharply that staying out began to look more dangerous than stepping in. Each attempt to avoid confrontation only resulted in new provocations, new threats, new reminders that the conflict was widening its reach. Quietly, almost reluctantly, the nation crossed thresholds that had once been unthinkable. Convoys were armed. Escorts were sent across hostile waters. Lines drawn to separate involvement from neutrality blurred beneath the pressure of necessity. And while no official proclamation had yet been made, the truth was becoming unmistakable. The war was no longer something happening elsewhere. It was pressing against the nation's own door. The chain of events that had begun as distant warnings had now forged a path that could not be reversed. From whispered decisions to reluctant actions, from neutrality to confrontation, every moment drew the United States deeper into the storm that the world had tried, and failed, to contain. Every step deeper into that storm carried a cost, and it was a cost that grew heavier with every passing month. The effort to remain neutral while the world fractured demanded not only strategic caution, but a willingness to accept risks that no longer made sense. As the conflict widened, hesitation itself became dangerous, threatening the nation's security, its economy, and its place in a world rapidly slipping toward darkness. The weight of delay revealed itself first in the supply lines. With enemy forces tightening their grip on the seas, goods that had once moved freely now traveled under threat of interception or destruction. Insurance rates soared, shipping companies hesitated, and vital resources stalled on docks or vanished beneath the waves. Factories at home, once thriving under the boom of international demand, suddenly faced shortages that crippled production. Every lost ship was more than a statistic. It was a silent warning that the nation's lifelines were being cut, strand by strand. Inside high-level offices, frustration replaced the earlier uncertainty. Maps were updated daily with new losses, tankers sunk, cargo vessels attacked, merchant sailors missing. The argument for staying out grew weaker, not because the desire for peace had faded, but because the cost of inaction had begun to outweigh the fear of involvement. Each time the news broke of another vessel lost, the conversation returned to the same troubling conclusion. Neutrality was proving far more expensive than anyone had predicted. But economic damage was only one side of the cost. The psychological toll was just as profound. Reports of conquered nations and suffering civilians carried an emotional gravity that seeped into every discussion. Images of families fleeing across muddy roads, cities left in ruins, and entire populations forced under brutal rule, ignited debates that could no longer be silenced. The question echoing through meeting rooms was no longer, can we stay out, but how long can we ignore this? The moral tension grew sharper when new intelligence arrived describing the tightening grip of aggressive powers across Europe and Asia. Their ambitions no longer stopped at borders. They were pushing into oceans, reaching across continents, attempting to shape a world order that left no room for democratic ideals or open trade. If these forces succeeded, the consequences would reach far beyond foreign shores. A world dominated by totalitarian power would leave the United States isolated, economically strangled, and politically vulnerable. Silence began to feel like complicity and hesitation like surrender. American military planners, studying the rapid victories of these expanding regimes, recognized another cost: time. Every day spent attempting to maintain distance allowed adversaries to grow stronger, their armies larger, their technologies more advanced. A future confrontation, once considered unlikely, now appeared inevitable. And if that confrontation arrived after these powers had consolidated their control, the price would be catastrophic. The nation was also confronting a harsh reality at home. Military readiness lagged far behind the escalating global threat. Equipment was outdated, forces undertrained, and defensive strategies built for a world that no longer existed. Remaining neutral did not preserve safety. It eroded preparedness. Each day spent pretending the conflict was distant was a day lost in strengthening the defenses that would one day be desperately needed. The cost of hesitation also revealed itself in diplomacy. Allies who once saw the United States as the world's stabilizing force wondered how long they could rely on a nation that insisted on standing apart while they fought for survival. Their fear was not merely that America wouldn't come, but that it would wait too long. Trust weakened, and relationships once built on cooperation strained under the pressure of desperation. Even as leaders continued searching for ways to protect neutrality, events forced their hand. Hostile submarines prowled closer to American shores. Spy networks intensified their activity. Communications intercepted from abroad hinted at broader plans that made it clear the war's reach was expanding toward the Western Hemisphere. In private briefings, intelligence officers voiced concerns that waiting for a direct attack before acting would be a mistake the nation could not afford to make twice. Still, many clung to the hope that diplomacy could succeed, that negotiations could curb aggression, that sanctions could slow the advance of hostile powers. But each attempt at peaceful deterrence was met with bold defiance. Regions continued to fall. Treaties were ignored. Military exercises near strategic territories grew disturbingly frequent. It became painfully evident that the aggressors interpreted American restraint not as wisdom, but as weakness. Then came the tipping point, the realization that neutrality was no longer protecting the nation. It was exposing it. The more the country tried to stand apart, the more brazen the challenges to its security became. Attackers tested boundaries, probing for vulnerabilities, assuming the United States would not respond. And the longer the nation delayed, the more confident they grew. Within the halls of government, the tone shifted from debate to urgency. Advisors argued that failing to act would leave future generations to face enemies emboldened by years of unchecked expansion. Military leaders warned that war might arrive on America's terms today, or on the enemy's terms tomorrow. And so the cost of hesitation crystallized into a single, unavoidable truth. Staying out was no longer the safer path. The decisions made in quiet rooms, once intended to preserve peace, had led the nation to a crossroads where the danger of waiting had eclipsed the danger of acting. The world had changed, and the price of pretending otherwise had become impossible to bear. When the final threads of neutrality unraveled, it became clear that the nation had not been thrust into war by a sudden blow, but carried there by the weight of choices made long before the first shot reached its shores. The world had shifted beneath its feet slowly at first, then with increasing force until isolation became nothing more than a fading hope. Every quiet decision, every reluctant adjustment, every moment of hesitation had shaped the path that led to this point. And as the storm finally broke, the nation understood that it had stepped into the conflict not for glory, not for conquest, but because the cost of doing nothing had become too great. The oceans that once promised safety could no longer shield it. The dangers that once seemed distant had arrived at its doorstep. The ideals it held dear, freedom, security, and the balance of world power, were now under threat in ways that demanded action. The decisions made in silence had brought the United States to the edge. What came next would be decided in fire and sacrifice, but also in resolve. For in the end, the story was not only about how a reluctant nation was pulled into the world's greatest war. It was about how, in the darkest moment of global crisis, it became a force capable of turning the tide, and history would remember that shift not as a single moment, but as the culmination of every choice that came before it.